Good morning, dear friends. We are here again today because we have some news. I'm going to cut to the chase. I got, let's say, the first draft of this new book by Mauro Biglino, written by four hands, with Francesco Esposito. Friends of the channel don't need, let's say, any special introductions because they surely know them. And so I would say let's go straight to the reason for our meeting, and that is to introduce a little bit Mauro and Francesco with you, this new book. First of all, good morning to both of you.
Good morning to everybody.
Good morning to everybody who is listening to us.
So Mauro, I was very pleased to have had the opportunity to read a preview of this book because I was very impressed with it, as I was very impressed with the others that you did. Of course, that were more focused on the Old Testament. This one, on the other hand, is a book that goes to talk about Jesus. And the interesting thing is that, in my opinion, as long as you talk about Yahweh, as long as you talk about the Old Testament, those who look at these things with a faith approach can always say, well, that was Yahweh, the Old Testament has been superseded, the new one is different. Instead, now you guys have gone to touch the very bare threads here of the Christian religion and the Catholic religion, then deal with the subject of Jesus. You have already dealt with Jesus so much, even in other videos. However, here in this book, somehow everything is put together in a more organic way. The title of the book is Jesus Demigod. And so the first question, Mauro, I would like to ask you is really about the title. What does Jesus Demigod mean? Who were these demigods?
Jesus demigod is without the article, not Jesus the demigod. Why? Because Jesus belonged to a specific category that in antiquity was very well known in all civilizations, and therefore the absence of the article stands for the non-uniqueness of his belonging to that category and the so-called demigods. To be brief but very clear, at the risk of also being crude, were the children of someone belonging to the human race and someone belonging to a higher civilization that, depending on the parts of the world, was obviously called in different ways. We in the Bible know that they are the Elohim. Jesus himself recognizes them when he invokes an El. So actually demigod for this, because son of a human and son of one of them. But we talk about this abundantly within the book. And so obviously we don't address it here. But 50% was human DNA. So demigods. One of many.
It's one of the many, so one of the many, as you are used to say, even of Yahweh, who was one of the many among the many Elohim who frequented certain areas of the Middle East. So Jesus is also one of the many. I'm sure this book will also trigger, let's say, the curiosities and maybe even controversies of some, although then the intent is not that. But instead, one thing that is interesting found in the book is that, and before addressing the subject in short to the life of Jesus, through the main events of his existence as they are told in the Gospels, you also try to reconstruct the context in which he lived and the context in which the written sources were then precisely written down and then handed down to us. Here I turn the ball over to Francesco Esposito, who in the book has helped to reconstruct just this context here. The first thing I'd like to ask you, Francesco, which struck me very much and which very few times is highlighted, is the fact that in the Christian community of the origins, it was actually not monolithic, this Christian community of the origins, but it was crossed by different faults of conflict.
I wanted
That's
to
right.
highlight what I think is also a definition, in my opinion, a wrong definition, which perhaps should be overcome, the definition of Judeo-Christians. That is, those who are currently identified as those still belonging to the branch of Judaism, which I basically identify with the Jesuans. Who are the Jesuans? The Jesuans are the original ones belonging to the movement Jesus wanted, a messianist movement, an apocalyptic movement, but mind you, always within the Judaic enclosure, therefore the Jewish enclosure. What is different instead of the intended division, split intended instead by Paul and then by the Paulinists, so by those who were Paul's followers, that instead in that Christos, which always means Messiah, but here we are instead in the Greek, that Christos instead is something else, that is that Pauline Messiah becomes something else. Paul, who then has to sell this doctrine to a Gentile audience that has a different sensibility, we are still within the Roman Empire. So here the knowledge of the context must be crucial, as Mauro and I well emphasize in the book several times. Here, since Paul has to sell this different doctrine to the Gentiles, the first thing it does is to transform the Jewish Messiah, thus the Greek Christos, into something different, thus into a character who has a, yes, saving mission, but not for Israel, but for all the people, thus for all peoples indeed. Thus here the universalist character, and then a salvation intended for all, is especially a salvation not political in nature, but eschatological in nature, that is, related to life after death. And here on the Pauline doctrine, and I will close, we will dwell a lot with Mauro, because this is where then the various faiths originate. We could say like this, on the resurrection, on the divinity of Jesus, so it is Paul who then initiates officially to its doctrine.
So we've already, let's say, put two very important points, the first of which is the fact that Jesus is a demigod, one of many, like Yahweh was an Elohim, one of many. And you now tell us that even early Christianity, in addition to being split in itself, was also one of the many faiths, of course, of the many multiple ones that were part of antiquity. You mentioned Paul, that was my next question, so maybe I'll ask you very briefly to clarify that, although then later on the book talks about it. That is Paul, the founder of Christianity, so in the end he kind of takes the primacy away from Jesus.
Yes, I really answer in 2 minutes. By now, all scholars agree that Jesus was a 360-degree Jew, a Jesus who never wanted to deal with a new religion, a Jesus who, along with his own, so we're always in the Jesuit enclosure, within his group, best to remember, were well saved within their Jewish culture and belonging, their Jewish tradition. They never questioned what at the time were the three basic elements for a more righteous Jew, so circumcision, law, and temple. Paul, on the other hand, as I was telling you before, creates this original rift because starting from Galatian letters to get to, for example, Philippian letters, Paul is very clear. Circumcision is no longer needed. The law is no longer needed because if you get circumcised, you are obligated to practice the whole law. The temple no longer exists since, for Paul, the true temple to follow is the body of Christ, which is the true temple. And we, Paul says, are members of this great temple, which is the body of Christ. So, as you can well see, Paul creates this transformation, this departure indeed from the Judaic doctrine, and rather than a founder conscious of Christianity, because Paul never calls himself a Christian in his letters, this is very clear. Paul can be considered the initiator and the inspirer of what will later be that fundamental doctrine. Because if Paul disavows these three foundational elements of Judaism, and then lo and behold turns Christ into something else and addresses all nations with the universalist doctrine, which lo and behold Jesuit Messianism absolutely was not, is what it became afterwards, inspired by Paul, and precisely then very slowly the Christianity that we know well.
So Mauro, the second part of the book then is completely dedicated to reviewing certain aspects that we think we know of Jesus' life through certain episodes, which are those of the baptism, the passion, the resurrection, and so on. However, there is one thing that struck me, that you review the whole chronology just of Jesus' life.
Well, I review the whole chronology this time, always pretending that what is written in the Gospels is true. Of course, this is the premise of all the work, because none of us know, no one in the world knows whether what is written there is true. But if it is true, what is written there, and it is correctly and consistently related with other historical events of his time, external to the Gospels but related, and people who read the book will see you well described, connected to the figures in the Gospels, like the execution of John the Baptist. We discover historically that Jesus did not die at the age of 33, but died around 40. That is, dead. He was crucified between the age of 42 and 43. Now I realize that this undermines a lot of currents of thought, esoteric, initiatic. So I think of all those who to the 33 have given a particular meaning, and I realize that it could be devastating to take note of the fact that 33 has absolutely nothing to do with it. But if anything, they should take, with benefit of inventory, of course, 42, 43, they choose because the exact date does not exist. That is, it cannot be derived with precise accuracy, but roughly the extra 10 years. Plus, these appear clearly in the gospel accounts and in the relationships that the gospels make between the historical fact of Jesus' life and what was going on outside with Herod, and so on and so forth. So it is also necessary to see this, because inevitably it calls into question a whole series of thought forms that were connected to this famous E33, and then we there on the inside take into consideration a whole series of acts that theology, the elaboration that Francesco explained to us, the Pauline elaboration, and then all the later ones, have seen theologically, but reading carefully the Gospels in Greek, again literally translating the moment of conception, say the crucifixion and the subsequent burial, the ascension of Jesus, or rather the assumption of Jesus, appear to be from the text quite different from what we have been told.
This is truly extraordinary, because still after 2 years of study, of exegesis, of theology on the life of this personage, and then since the sources are not even that many, you would presume that many details were known, even important, and basically not even too hidden, too latent as the ones you have highlighted today. So it is really hard to think that there is anything new to say about Jesus. Instead, you have made this book that I have to say, like, let's say, in the best style of your Mauro, when you have finished reading it, it leaves you with 3,000 more questions, but it also makes you realize that a lot of stuff maybe can be thrown out of the window and start again. I want to ask Francis then, so the second part of this book is devoted precisely to the life of Jesus and the main episodes in the life of Jesus. Do you want to tell us something about one of these episodes that, let's say, may be interesting?
Mauro mentioned the question of ascension, but better to say assumption. However, here, Mauro made a not insignificant clarification, that is, Jesus intentionally is descending to heaven, so Jesus intentionally is taking his feet off the ground to reach, we might say so, the hyperuranic regions. However, here, Mauro, on the other hand, has made a clarification. I was saying not insignificant, very careful, because we speak precisely of assumption. So, and when we talk about assumption, it is something that you are not wanting you, so it is not something that is related to your specific will, but there is an active subject that allows you to detach yourself from the earth to the sky, an element in common, which moreover is present in other moments in the life of Jesus, very important moments, but even more, it is a constant element that has characterized all the histories of the peoples of antiquity. So not only the Jewish people, but also the Greek tradition, the Latin tradition, the Roman tradition, but we can go even earlier, so we can go even to more remote times. However, of course, for those who will read this book will also really discover this fascinating aspect, which is related not only, I was saying, to the ascension assumption, but also to other important moments in Jesus' life.
Mauro, I'll pass the ball to you. I would say we're going towards the conclusion. You say something, let's say maybe about the motivations, about what motivated you to do this work and what is new, also compared to maybe not only what other scholars say, but also what that you have already said in other work or videos that you have done.
Look, what pushed us to do this work was the willingness to bring together the experience and knowledge that with his 2 degrees Francesco Esposito has related to patristics, that is, to the origins of the history of the church, and then to understand how they have reworked in light of the Pauline words, have reworked the figure of Jesus by elaborating a theology that is not there in the Gospels. The other part was precisely putting together with Francis my part, which makes me realize that in fact, contrary to what the church is actually doing, which is sharply dividing, it is trying to sharply divide the Old Testament from the New Testament. We recall that Benedict XVI said that the name Yahweh should not be used in the liturgy because it is not Christian. And so this is very precise indication, and it doesn't. That is the way we present it in this book. Jesus would be found. We always use the conditional tense so as not to be dogmatic, which precisely we don't want to be. Would find himself in perfect continuity with what is written in the Old Testament. He himself says, I have not come to change anything but to bring to fulfillment. But if we are to consider this bringing to fulfillment, we must, as we have done, highlight the common elements, because in fact, as Francis mentioned, there are elements that are present in the Old Testament and that reappear in the Gospels especially, but also in Paul, for example, letter to the Corinthians, etc., and which the church obviously tries to keep separate, in order to be able to give one a certain kind of interpretation and the others another kind of interpretation, presenting Jesus in one way and attributing to him a figure that he in fact does not have in the Gospels.
Perfect, by the way, in this period when we also hear a lot about anti-Semitism and all the arguments that revolve around that. It's also right to remember that this character that we have universalized through just, as you said, Mauro, as you said, Francis, through Paul's work was a Jew and he was radically Jewish, and the first Jesuits who have him, the first followers of his Jesus who followed him, were radically Jewish and connected to that culture there.
Correct preservation, David. That is, we must never forget that Jesus was a Jew who followed, certainly reading his sayings, one of the 2 Pharisaic schools of the time. They were Hillel and Shammai. He was a deep connoisseur of the Old Testament, so much so that he explained it in the synagogues, and so he was very well prepared. But he was a Semite, he was a Jew, he was a Jew. So was Paul, moreover. And so Christianity is actually a branch of Judaism, a branch of the Jewish religion, so other than anti-Semitism. We are perfectly within to Semitism, which many people may not like, but
Never like that. So I would say that as a presentation is enough, so much so that I hope so many will have the desire, the patience, the curiosity to go and see this new work. I think really they will find very interesting things, absolutely new, and also arranged with a much more accomplished organicity than maybe other times in other studies. Both Francis and Mauro have proposed on this theme, Jesus.
thanks to our gentleman editor, whose name is Davide Bolognesi,
I was able to, let's say, read the preview and contribute. While doing that, I really found so many interesting insights. Then I, who was educated in Catholic doctrine anyway, I wondered why these things are not known earlier.
thanks to the publisher Tuthi, who is extremely rigorous. We noticed, you noticed too, it allowed precisely to arrive at this book that I know that everybody speaks well of their Pargolese, but I mean, I can't do otherwise. It's really a nice edition.
Most of all, thanks to you. Thanks also to those who are listening to us now. And so again, thank you very much, Mauro. Thank you very much, Francis. For all those who are following us, you can find the link to purchase in the description of this video. Have a good evening. Have a good day, everybody.
Hello, thank you to Francis, and goodbye to everybody, and of course, good reading.
Hello, everyone. Thank you.